So we have talked about just about everything except biomes. Now, a large part of chapter 4 basically goes through every biome that they recognize and talks about what's there in a lot of detail, and we're not going to do that. Okay, this is not, you've done enough of that, I think, in previous grades, or at least that's what the standards tell me, that you know all that stuff. And I don't know that it's worth that much at this point to do anyway. What we do need to do is be able to differentiate those biomes in terms of the two most important climate numbers that determine what biome goes where. Because what biomes are, remember, are types of ecosystems that show up again and again, right? Like if the conditions are right, it's going to be a rainforest. If the conditions are different than that, maybe it's going to be a different kind of forest. Maybe it's going to be a grassland. Maybe it's going to be a desert. What we need to look at is what is it that makes them be where they are. So what do you think? What are going to be the two numbers you want to know the most to figure out what goes there? Is that desert? Is that grassland? Is that tundra? What are the two numbers you want to know? What's one?
Climate.
Right, but like what about the climate? What two climate numbers would you want? Temperature would certainly be one. Is that temperature high? Is it low? Is it seasonal? Right? Are there times of year when it's much colder or much warmer? Or is it consistently warm? Or is it consistently cold? In other words, what climate zone are we in? That would be important for sure. What's the other one, Amanda? Elevation definitely matters, but only in as much as it affects things like temperature in this other number. Yeah, like how much rainfall, or in some cases snowfall, right? Precipitation is this area getting? Yeah, that's it. So let's start with temperature, then we'll do precipitation. We'll kind of rank the types of biomes according to those, and that's really as much as we need to do. Temperature as in climate zone, precipitation as in rain or snowfall. But remember, you're looking for it. Okay, so let's start cold. Let's start at the edges, the polar regions. Get far enough north or south, and there is a permanent layer of ice. That's a biome, it turns out. Stuff lives there. Not a lot of stuff, but stuff. Tundra, which you know, tundra is not ice year-round, but is cold enough year-round that there is a permanent layer of frozen earth not so far under the surface, which basically means, what that means for the vegetation of the tundra is that it's all going to be pretty low, scrubby stuff. It's not enough soil for tall vegetation to dig into to grow, and so we see, of course, a very short growing season and pretty small plant life, pretty scrubby, hardy plant life. Then, as you move further south or north into south, we see what we call the taiga. That's a Russian word, or an alternative name for it is the boreal forest, which means northern. Now, this one turns out to be one that spans across two different climate zones, because you also find taiga in the temperate zone. That is one that kind of crosses over. Think, if you've ever been to northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Montana, up into Canada, that's all taiga, and it's not quite polar by the time you get up there. The rest of the temperate zone biomes you're fairly familiar with. Temperate forest. That's the one, by the way, that we have here, and we do have in some places. Had we not cleared it, mostly. Temperate forest includes lots of deciduous trees, the kind that lose their leaves in the fall. There is also such thing as a temperate rainforest. We find that in this country, mostly in the northwest, call it often the northwest coniferous forest, and up into the west coast of Canada. Then we have temperate grassland, which you begin to see patches of here, but really becomes widespread as you go a little further west into, Nebraska and Kansas. If you've ever actually driven all the way to Colorado from here, you know about our temperate grasslands. It might be the most boring drive on earth, driving through Kansas and Nebraska. It's just straight up flat, all grassland. And then, of course, there are places in the temperate zone where we find deserts, where there's not enough rainfall to grow a whole lot. And that is another one that crosses over. We see deserts in both the temperate zone and the tropical zone. So here are the tropical biomes. A little less variation here because of the very constant temperatures. It's really just all about rainfall in the tropics. That's what changes what's there. So if there's a whole bunch of rainfall, we see a rainforest. If there's low to medium rainfall, we see a grassland, which we also call the savanna. And if it's super, super dry, it's a desert. So there's your temperature rankings. And as far as what you need to be able to do, there's no order here in terms of within each zone. I just need you to know which ones belong in which zones, right? So if I ask, okay, what are 3 biomes you find in the tropical climate zone? You gotta be able to list those 3, not necessarily in that order. Does that make sense? So just be able to plug the right ones into the right zones and you're good. Temperature. Then we've got precipitation. Precipitation rankings really even easier because there's a good rule of thumb here. If you want to know how much rainfall an ecosystem is getting, look at how tall their producers are. If the plants are really tall, chances are they're getting enough rainfall to support them, right? So forests kind of win. The forests are the high to medium rainfall ecosystems. Obviously, we can kind of order these things in terms of, the rainforest has the most, tropical or temperate. Regular temperate forests, there are medium. And taiga is a little lower than that, mainly because, not because there's a lack of precipitation, but because for a lot of the year where taigas are, that water is locked up as ice, right? It's not available. Typically, if we're not seeing enough rainfall to support trees, that's going to cause there to be grasses. It's grasses that are going to dominate with the occasional kind of scrub bush type thing. Typically, a temperate grassland is getting a little more rainfall than a savanna, but not always. And then we have our ultra dry areas. Tundra and deserts. Really 2 different reasons there, though. It's not that a tundra lacks precipitation. It's that for a large part of the year, all of the water that falls is locked up as ice. One of the reasons why we consider Antarctica to be the world's driest desert, because most of the time, fresh water is not available. Locked up as ice. And then desert, of course, defined by its lack of rainfall. That's how it qualifies as a desert. So that's an obvious one. And this rule of thumb we're talking about is not perfect, but pretty good. the taller the producers, the more precipitation happens in that ecosystem. Questions so far? Temperature, precipitation. Those are the two things you need to have sort of a relative idea about these different biomes in terms of how they rank in those two climate numbers. Here is an example of how you might have to use that knowledge. And it's actually a question straight from a state test. And it's one of those questions that kids kind of got deer in headlights about enough that I like to show it. Here's what it looked like. Selected North American biomes. And basically, they gave them this graph, temperature on the Y, precipitation on the X, and said, and the question was something like, given the two biomes that we've revealed, what are the rest of the letters correspond to? What biomes would W, X, Y, and Z correspond to? So let me give you a minute, stare at it, see if you can figure out by process, do the easy ones first and let that kind of inform. Remember, these are North American biomes. That helps a little bit. See what you can do. I'll come back to you. Did you get it right on a state test? Knock out an easy one for me. Someone, give me one that you think you're pretty confident is you know what's going on there.
Why is the rainforest?
You think, why is the rainforest? And why is that?
Because it gets tons of rainfall. It's warmer.
Yeah, so we're definitely kind of the furthest right on precipitation. That makes sense that there's lots of rainfall there. Pretty wide variation, which is interesting, in the rainfall. But the temperature, not only is it high, I mean, it's not higher than anything else necessarily, but what makes this definitely a tropical biome is how narrow this is, right? In the tropical zone, we're not going to see a lot of temperature variation. We're going to see, 80s-ish weather pretty much all the time. The only difference is between the rainy and the dry season. And so, yeah, you nailed it. That narrow band means tropical, and that high rainfall means rainforest. Good. So there's one down. And we've also already got the temperate and taiga forests. What else you got?
W by desert.
W, desert. Why?
Very thin on the precipitation and very towards the zero. And then its peak is pretty high up there.
Yeah, so definitely the driest and not variable that way. And that makes sense because the desert is sort of defined by its low rainfall. What do you got, man?
We is the taiga.
Okay, let's talk about desert. Just one more thing though. Do you think this would be a tropical or a temperate desert? With this kind of variation in temperature? Yeah, I'd say it's definitely a temperate version of a desert and not a tropical. Good. What were you saying, Amanda? You think Z is taiga. Why?
Temperature is low.
Okay.
And as there's not a huge variation.
I would say you'd have a decent argument, except they already gave us taiga. That's what coniferous forest is, at least in terms of what they're saying here. I see where that was confusing because we did have a northwest coniferous type rainforest thing, and that's fine. But yeah, I think this is supposed to be taiga. What would that make this? What do you think? With low precipitation and low temperature. It's a little cold for a temperate grassland. It's almost like the polar version of the grassland. Yeah, tundra. I think this should be tundra. It's very cold and it's pretty low precipitation. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. And it kind of takes that process of elimination to figure that out once you've got the other stuff. But yeah, X being clearly a temperate zone kind of thing with the temperature variability, but being low on the precipitation scale, I think that would kind of define it as a temperate rather than tropical grassland. Good. Yeah, that's how it shook out on the test. Not an easy question, but I feel like if we've got the information we just looked at, you can do it. Good? Okay, I'm gonna give you sample essays. You'll have some time to work on them today. You can count on some time to work on them tomorrow as well.